Welcome here today. Welcome to our webinar on understanding the impact of building relationships. My name is Lisa Attygalle. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the Tamarack Institute. As we begin today, let's take a moment to reflect on the land that we're on, its history, the impacts of colonization, and to acknowledge the truths, to sit in those truths, and name our commitment to action through reconciliation. This includes respecting the land and waters, keeping our promises, partnering with humility, respect, and honor, and living forward in a way that brings harmony and balance in a world where nobody lives at the expense of another. Today is also Black History Month, the beginning of a focused month of learning, of respecting, of lifting up Black voices. We will be sharing a link to a resource that my colleagues Rochelle and Angelina have pulled together to help us throughout this month. I'm excited to introduce our guest today, and here he is in the flesh. David J. is the founder of Relationality Lab, providing tools, tactics, and resources to help people who nurture the relationships that drive movements for justice, sustainability, and liberation. When our team here at Tamarack found out about the work that David's been doing to measure the impact of building relationships, we got really excited and reached out, and are so just grateful that you're joining us here today, David, to share your work and learnings with everybody here in the call. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here today. My name is David J. He, him pronouns. I'm joining from unceded Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here today and to get to know this community. And I know that, Lisa, from what you shared, there's so many people who are doing relational work, so many people who are building community here, that I'm hoping what I can share can be useful today. I'm hoping this can be the start of conversations with those of you in the audience where it's relevant and interesting.
Love it. So to get us started, why don't you share a little bit, David, about what brings you to your work at Relationality Lab?
Yeah. So I've had this career at the intersection of technology and community organizing. I got started around, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, grew up on right next to a red line where inequity was something that I was aware of on a day-to-day basis throughout my childhood. And then became trained in high school on anti-racist organizing, on queer organizing, and when I was in undergrad, started this community for people like me who identify as asexual. And this wound up being the first one of the first places and the first significant place that ace people, people who don't experience sexual attraction or who experience little sexual attraction, started coming together. And I'd spent most of my life up to that point really feeling alone, really not being told that relationships were not a thing I could build because I wasn't building relationships that followed traditional scripts. And as ACE people came together, we not only realized that that wasn't true, we found a place to tell stories to one another. We found a place to feel seen and heard that we never been able to find before. I found that, many other ACE people found that, and we found that on this website online. And I got to see firsthand how sharing those sorts of stories not only transformed our lives, not only allowed us to trust one another and build relationships, but built power that could, in some pretty concrete and fundamental ways, start to shift the world around us. And I got hooked. I got hooked on the power of building relationship, the power of building relationship around these sorts of meaningful stories. And as I became a software developer to explore how that could happen online. And then I wound up at this small nonprofit here in the Bay Area called the Center for Humane Technology. They were telling this story about how social media was failing us, about how social media was not, in fact, making us more connected in the way that it had promised it would. And it was resonating with a lot of people. A lot of people were showing up at the doorstep, wanting to do something. They were generating this huge audience, but that audience was not talking to one another. They weren't forming relationships, so they weren't really building power. And they brought me in because I said, look, I think I can help you do that. I think I can help you build relationships. And I started really getting to experiment with ways online, offline. This was during the this quickly became the pandemic, and then there was a lot of online ways of bringing people, not only bringing people together to build relationships, but seeing if I'm bringing people together in a bunch of different places, where are the relationships really happening? And I also got, I'd say, a pretty inside view to these extremely well-funded, innovative companies that were said they were out to build relationship, and got to see some of why they'd failed to do that, why the things they were counting and the way that they were measuring and thinking about what they created in the world was failing them in that.
Wow.
And
That's
so, last thing, just to bring us there, based on that, I left my work at the Center for Humane Technology and started a project called Relationality Lab, to both figure out how to make relational work more visible, how to know when we create a room and there's magic in the room, how do we show the world that that magic exists? And very related to that, to figure out how to close the gap between movements and money, because I saw so many people who were doing really powerful relational work and not and burning out because they weren't getting funded, and so many people who had access to resources but didn't understand the power of that relational work and were looking for something to be hopeful about. And so I'm trying to figure out how to bridge that gap.
I love that. And this, I feel like you've dropped a lot of seeds that we're going to be kind of growing throughout our conversation today. And I feel like you've kind of referenced how relationship building is so essential, yet it's so hard to grasp and understand and include as part of action plans, or to name the specificities of the outputs, or the outcomes that it's contributing to. And I love that you've identified and seen this piece of the work and are seeking to kind of like shine a light on it. And so to ground us in this topic of relationship building and, where it kind of fits, I think collectively we see relationships as essential to so many things. A lot of the Tamarack network is working towards kind of large scale community change or systems change. And we know how important it is for that large scale work as well. And I think just to ground us, I want to just bring this forward. Many people on the call would use this framework, the Water of Systems Change, which was developed by John Kania, Mark Kramer, and Peter Senge, to understand when we want to shift the conditions, when we want to make systems change, we need to shift the conditions that are holding it in place. And we see that relationships and connections are one of these conditions, right? It's an opportunity to make change, and it's also a condition that often is a sticking point. And when we talk about, or when they talk about relationships and connections, it's defined as the quality of connections and communication occurring among actors in the system, especially those with differing histories and viewpoints. And so given, if we're planning, if we're talking about building movements, making community change happen, I'm wondering, how does one go about focusing on that area, right? How does one go about building relationships when we're talking about social change?
Well, I will give what is very much an answer that I've found helpful. Something I've learned is that there are many lineages of wisdom about how to build relationship, and many, including many, I'm sure, in this room that I don't personally come from, not tapped into. So what I give is my answer, not the answer. And my answer draws both on my my kind of lineage of movement history and queer movements, and a little surprisingly, but I find it useful on my background is in physics. So my grandfather was a physicist. He actually turned down a spot in the Manhattan Project. Um, and I've studied physics. I found it to be very helpful. And I had this realization several years ago about this beautiful intersection between my relational organizing lineage and the way of understanding the world that I learned through physics. Um, and it kind of if any of you have read Parable of the Sower, it um, uh, references comes to this idea of change. That book starts with the phrase um, whatever you touch, you change. Whatever you change. Parable of the Sower, Bray, Bree. Whatever you touch, you change. Whatever you change, changes you. The only constant is change. God is change. I might be missing a line there. By Octavia Butler, and uh, and when I think about what a relationship is, to me, a relationship exists whenever two entities in the universe change one another. So if I'm changed by a person, then if I'm changed just a little bit, then we have a pretty weak relationship. If I'm changed a lot, then we have a really strong relationship. My daughter, Tavi, short for Octavia, who's 5, like when she was born, that fundamentally changed my life. And is this ongoing process of transformation. And at the same time, it's this process of resilience, right? If I have a good day, if I have a bad day, if I have a stressful day, when I see her, when I pick her up from kindergarten, I'm sort of snapped back to being her parent. So it's this transformational and resilient change. And that kind of change exists in all relationships, not just the relationships that I have with other people, the relationships that organisms have in ecosystems, the relationships that proteins have within a cell, have that nature of both transformation and resilience in them. And I found that not only was that helpful for me thinking about what a relationship is and sort of how powerful a relationship is in the context of my organizing work, it translates in a pretty powerful way into the language of physics. And that is to say that that concept of change is the same as information. So whenever one thing changes another thing, you can say, if you're using physics and language, that they have exchanged information. And so I started looking into, and I'm going to show you a quick screen share here. I started looking into the properties of systems which exchange information. So you can see here we have 2 nodes. They kind of randomly shoot information out in the world, but then sometimes they randomly shoot information to one another. And the more likely they are to shoot information to one another, the more they shoot information to one another, the more likely they become to keep doing that. And eventually they go from sort of this random motion to stable exchange of information with one another. And this model, this sort of shift from chaos to kind of a chaotic information system to a stable information system, shows up anywhere that relationships exist. Again, people, ecosystems, cells, relationships, relationships defined as this kind of exchange of information exist throughout the human and more than human world. And interestingly, these relationships all have something in common. They all have some fundamental things about the kinds of environments they like to grow in, about the things we can know about them, the things we can predict, and very importantly, can't predict about them, which I'll get to in a second. And so to me, this is what a relationship is. And how we build relationship is that, and I'm going to give my kind of relational system Z answer, and then I'm going to give a personal story answer, and hopefully that'll illustrate and stay within our time. But relationships like to grow in certain kinds of environments. All relationships grow through a process of evolution. And if you look into the world, there are some environments, some ecosystems where evolution just happens a lot. Coral reefs, the canopy of rainforests, are places where evolution really happens. It's got the substances it needs. It's got the lots of tiny niches are really good often for evolution, and so you can create a rich environment for relationships to form. So when I was at the Center for Humane Technology organizing tech workers, and this is one example that I'm sure many folks in your community will have their own. I realized that the integrity workers, the people in charge of dealing with online harms from all the major platforms, weren't really talking to one another. So it was during the pandemic. I built trust with some of them. I created this online space where they could cluster with one another. So they, unlike a Zoom call, they could sort of break off in little groups of 2 or 3. Because that liquidity, I found, that ability to control who you're talking to is a really important piece of a lot of how it's a pattern that shows up in a lot of relational systems. So I brought them together in this space. I gave them a sense of who else was in the room. I did just a little bit to create a shared context, a shared topic conversation. Then I gave them a lot of freedom to go deep with one another. Mm-hmm. And out of those regular sessions, kind of like virtual happy hours, we had people left their job and started a nonprofit. The head of Google's union started talking to folks from Amazon and Meta about internal worker organizing. Like, there was a lot of really rich stuff that happened in those sorts of relational containers. So the short answer to your question is, we see where relationships are needed, and then we construct environments where relationships can form through this process of evolution. And we can never know exactly what's going to come out of those environments, but we can know it's going to be good.
I love the visualization. I find so helpful, to imagine each interaction that I'm part of, or if I'm facilitating a space, how do I create those things? I want to go in 2 ways. And so I'm just going to hold one. I want to return to the conversation about how can we construct those environments to increase the opportunities for, more of those pings back and forth. But before we do that, can you talk a little bit about how can we learn about the relationships that we're building? So how do we see that little diagram that you showed? Like, how can we zoom out and see that for the work that we're doing? How do we know if our relationship building has made an impact, or how do we know what our nodes and pings look like?
So I want to start by saying what we can't know.
Okay.
And then I'll share a little bit about what we can. So one of the things that comes out of this work, for those of you who are familiar with the butterfly effect or nonlinear dynamics, say that you take say that I've got a way that I think a system built out of relationships is going to go, a way that I think it's going to go, a prediction, and then how it actually is. And I'm really, really good, and my prediction is like 99.999% accurate. What happens is that pretty quickly reality and my prediction diverge. I can't. There's a fundamental mathematical limit to my ability to predict how relationships are going to go over time. And the more relational my environment is, the more of that sense of magic, the more those connections are forming, the more people are changing one another, the faster these 2 things diverge. And so that has some really, to me, as someone who thinks about how do we fund this stuff? How do we fund the really critical work of building relationship? It puts us in tension with a lot of the way that nonprofit funding, that political funding happens, because often that is about predicting the future. It's about saying, I'm going to get this number to go up this many times. I'm going to get all these many people to do exactly this thing. And that form prediction, there's been critiques around, and there's I think discussion about trust-based philanthropy, about decolonizing philanthropy, about removing the control that funders have through their grants. And part of that is removing the necessity that when we create these spaces, we predict exactly what's going to come out of them. Mm-hmm. And instead saying, we're going to create a place for evolution. We can know a lot about how to create the context for evolution to happen. The heuristic for me is you can know how to create a good conversation, but you can't know where the conversation will lead. And the better the conversation is, the less you can know about where it'll go. So we can know how to create this space for a good conversation, but we can't predict its end state, which means that most of the ways that we're used to measuring success don't work all of a sudden. And as a result, relationships and relational work can sort of feel invisible at the same time as they feel deeply, deeply valuable. And so there are three things that when I work with organizations that I work with, and as I explore this research, sort of three things that I look to that are sort of indications about how much that evolution is happening.
Tell us.
Say what?
Tell us. What are the three things?
The first is collaboration. Are people showing up? Like, first, basic level, are they showing up to the thing that I'm holding? But the real indicator is, are they showing up with one another outside of the spaces I convene? So are people meeting in my spaces and then getting coffee, or having a Zoom call, or having some follow-up? And I've been experimenting with things like a really simple SMS survey after an event that says, or at the end of an event that says, do you plan to have a follow-up conversation with anyone you've met at this event? As an indicator of the relationality of whatever that container was. The second is collaboration. So most of the time when I'm organizing, I'm a really big believer in after spaces. So you have the formal event, with your structure and your speakers and your whatever. And then afterward, there's some place with food where people can just mingle and talk to whoever they want to talk to. And if I've done my job well, everyone goes into that space with at least one or two conversations they're really excited to have that they haven't had the space to have in the formal time, right? So I'll wander through those and just catch up with, try to see, are there things emerging in those conversations, or I'll harvest them as part of my facilitation process. Are there things emerging? Are there collaborations emerging that are aligned with the values that had me bring this event together, but that are surprising? What kinds of surprises has this event generated? And usually that's a number of surprises, but more importantly, it's a series of stories. And so I'm capturing those stories, I'm thinking about them, and then I'm saying, do these stories do the stories that these spaces are generating move forward the work that I want to move forward? And then the last one, and to me, I think this is the subtlest but most critical, is care. Do people in the community feel like they are caring for one another? Do they feel cared for by one another? And I need to model that at some convenient space. But if people are showing up to support one another in their professional and personal lives, that is almost always a precursor to really intense creativity, really intense power being built.
I love, and I want to go again two ways with this one. It's like, how do you've talked about creating spaces after an event. You've talked about people meeting and letting the conversation go where it is. What are the things, in addition to kind of creating that free-flowing space after the event, what are the things that a host, a convener, a funder, somebody who's wanting to facilitate relationship building, what are the things that they can do to create more of those environments for relationships and evolution of relationships?
So there are a few patterns that I've found. And I'm going to sort of speak in patterns because I imagine that many people here already have deep experience, and I don't want to be prescriptive. One pattern is going from a big space to small spaces.
Okay.
So I'll show you one more thing here. If you create. Here I take the same number of nodes. Here they're all talking to one another. Here they're in these little clusters.
Like breakout groups, yep.
Like breakout groups. Nodes in small clusters almost always form relationships faster.
Yep.
Because they're in a less noisy environment. I talked about coral reefs before. I talked about tiny niches. The fact that we are made up of a bunch of small cells, like this notion of you create a bunch of little spaces and then you have the little spaces talk to one another, it shows up wherever is a pattern that seems to exist across a lot of relational systems. So breaking people into small groups, and giving them enough of a sense of shared story and shared purpose.
Mm.
The other thing that shows up, and I allude to this, is a process of evolution. So evolution is exploration. I've got some way that a bunch of possibilities appear around me. Differentiation, I've got some way of knowing which of those possibilities are most compelling. And then selection, I can release most of the possibilities, focused in on the powerful ones, and explore from that point. So when I think about creating a space, creating spaces with small groups, creating other spaces for relationship, I often think about how do I place people in an area where there's something rich to explore. How do I help them see the possibilities in the people around them? And then how do I help them differentiate it? Differentiation is almost, in my practice, almost always about emotion. It's about being grounded in my body. It's so that when a possibility emerges that resonates for me, my face can light up. Someone can see that my face lights up. Their face can light up. We can all know that that's of all the threads we've explored in this conversation, that's the one that we want to zero in on. Mm-hmm. And then selection is, it is easy to take a thing that you found that's powerful and focus in on it. So part of that after space or break spaces, like say I've had a bunch of structured conversations that are all about one thing, but a bunch of adjacent exciting topics have come up. People need time to zoom in on those topics. Mm-hmm. They need some of their own time that they can select with. And so having that combination is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that really interesting about that differentiation. How do we drill in on the thing that's interesting to each person? It's not about becoming the same, which could be a misconception of the visualization, right?
Yes.
It's about, you can say more about that.
It is about amplifying resonance. Mm-hmm. So if someone says something and it really resonates with one other person in the group, just making that known, even if it doesn't resonate with anyone else, so that the two of them can go off later. Or if it resonates with everyone in the group, maybe the conversation should shift to be about that thing. Mm-hmm. I see some great articles being posted in the chat here.
Yeah. There's also been a request that you repeat those 3 components again.
Yes. Okay. I might try to quickly bring up an illustration of this. And I want to be mindful about getting us to Q&A. But this is from a talk I gave a little while ago. I decided not to so exploration, this is an example in a conversation, but this process happens everywhere. Exploration, you try many different topics of conversation. Differentiation, you have feelings about those topics and express them. Selection, you focus in on the topics that are meaningful. And if a conversation can go through this cycle several times, then it'll be able to find its way off into something really meaningful. And when you think about the design of an environment, this process can be blocked or nurtured. So if I have an environment where no one is in touch with their feelings and it's not okay to express them, then you're going to have a lot of exploration. A bunch of ideas are going to come up. No one's going to have any idea which of those are most compelling, and it's just going to feel sort of staticky, and everyone's going to do what they're used to doing. Mm-hmm. But if you can create a place where it's okay to express emotion, then you have this room for the process to continue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. I want to talk about a couple things that I'm bringing my kind of practical brain to this. So I want to ask about that tension between, we need to get the work done, and especially, in online spaces, we want to be really respectful and not have, a 5-hour meeting, but we also want to create these open spaces for relationship building. And so what advice do you have for that nurturing of of relationship building, or the process, but then like how can we incorporate that as part of the work, or does this happen before, or how do you see relationship building connect with the like doing the work?
So the work always requires relationship.
Yeah.
Start with, start with the question of, for the world to change the way that we want to change, what relationships must exist,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and how do we need to be learned and changed by those relationships?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because as soon as we start building relationships, we have to give up control of the end state, and that's good. If I understand the values that I hold, if I understand the direction that I want the world to change in, then I can learn how it changes as I proceed. I don't need to land at the spot that I intended to at the beginning. And um, and I think about kind of different levels of relationship building. Um, a lot of people have an audience; they have an email list, and they kind of broadcast out, or Twitter following. I didn't get that. Sorry. They broadcast out to that. They broadcast out to. One of the things that I've done is create sort of landing point spaces. So I use this platform called AirMeet, though you can do the same thing in Zoom. And I would have talks like this, where I broadcast on my list, I'd get a few hundred people to show up. And then about 45 minutes in, I would stop the talk and I would have these little tables on the screen that each have a label, like the technologists go here, the educators go here, the student activists go here. And I invite people to just get in a room with the other people in the audience and share their stories. And I'd say, we're going to spend the last 15 minutes here, but there's no formal end. Like, you can stay and keep talking as long as you want to. And every week, I did this on a weekly basis. Every week we'd have people who were still there 3 hours later. Mm. Like, most people would leave, some people would stay. And it wasn't necessarily the people who stayed the longest were the people who I most wanted to engage with, though sometimes it was. But as I went around those tables, I learned a lot about our community, how people were showing up, who's holding space. We had other projects that started building out of those tables. And I kind of began to identify this group of leaders who I really wanted to build a relationship with. And then I invited them into the second kind of space, which was a little bit more like a happy hour, where I'd say, look, I have been talking to a dozen youth leaders around the world who are high school and college students who are doing incredible youth-led work. You all don't know one another, and you should. So I'm going to create this time where you come together. We're going to briefly introduce one another, and I'd use a platform like GatherTown or Spatial Chat, where people can move themselves around the screen, and they're only talking to the people they're close to, so they could naturally cluster up in the way that you would in a physical environment. And I'd invite them to do that, and they would go off and they'd create these groups and wander between them, and go deep with one another. And out of those groups came some really powerful collaborations, an entire youth-led response to people who were mobilizing resources around the genocide in Tigray. And so that, like, invite-only spaces that have some liquidity to them, where people can decide who they're talking to and meet new people, and these kind of more open spaces where there's a speaker as a draw and a set an agenda, and then people can connect with one another, are both really powerful.
I'm going to recap a few of you've mentioned a few times some of the indicators that we could be looking for to understand the strength of relationships, or the impact of creating those relationship building spaces. You've talked about duration of time people spend. Do they follow up afterwards? Do they have intention of meeting with each other? Have they met with each other? What are some of the other indicators that you see that people could use or look to understand that impact?
So there are some, out of research on social isolation, there's some standard instruments about whether you feel cared for by, they're sort of, the standard instrument is, how many people have you felt cared for by in the past month? And how many people have you felt that you cared for in the past month? And I've been interested in modifying those to be within the community. So how, if you're looking at a faith community, how many people in this faith community have you felt cared for by in the past month? As an interesting quantitative indicator. And then I will also, if I create a way to support projects, like say that there is there's a small grant available for community members who are working on projects. How many people apply for that grant is an interesting indicator. Because if the relational, sorry, I'm still staring at my screen. If relationships are flowing really well, you're going to get a bunch of ideas and a bunch of people who are going to want to apply. If you hold office hours where you just offer advice to people, how many people are signing up for those office hours with things they're doing that they want to connect with you around? Those, and how often do you in those office hours you can ask, did you meet through our community? I think those are some of the things that can get to the collaboration side. Convening is you're asking questions about time people spend, and care is you are formally or informally asking questions. One other thing, because this is that I've seen happen that's really effective, because this is about data, but it's also about stories, and you need stories to really get the nuance. I've seen people when they send around end of year thank you letter, they will they'll include a video from their executive director, but they'll use a platform like Video Ask. So it'll be a video from them, but it'll end with a question, and then people in the community can respond with their own video and say, here's a moment when this community felt important to me. And so they'll start building this story bank of videos that they can then reflect back to the community, they can share with funders, they can in other ways kind of get a sense of the flavor of the impact of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I love that there's so many tools available to help either facilitate these processes or measure them. We will move into Q&A now, and we have a number of questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to invite those who are interested, who have submitted questions, to come to join us to ask that question directly. And I believe that we have Bree available to come on camera and ask her question.
I'm going to promote Bree to a panelist so that they can join the conversation. And if they don't want to turn on the camera, that's fine too.
Hi, Bree, welcome.
Hey, great to meet you.
Good to see you.
I was not prepared to be on camera today in my very relaxed hoodie at home, but thank you. I'm just trying to see if I can find my question as I wrote it again, but I can't see it now. So I will try and kind of go back to what the gist was. First off, I love this, absolutely everything about it. As a self-confessed science nerd myself, I love just really looking at the entire relational experience of it. We always think of relationships as something unique and separate that humans have, but it's not. Yeah. So to be able to relate back to just how that all functions and works is amazing. And it made me think of some of the relational challenges that I experience as a person whose relationships are my go-to. That's my first and foremost, and how I operate as a leader and just as a human being in general. And one of the challenges that seem to be consistently experiencing over the last several years is, because relationships are so important to me, I really lean into all of them. And those are including the ones that kind of feel like a square peg in a round hole, where I get a lot of pushback, where I can't seem to find a space that's looking at and welcoming the differentiation that you were talking of like, because I love not necessarily conflict, but disagreement, because I think that's a really sweet spot that we get to learn about each other in really unique ways. if we're willing to hear and listen. But I know I'd seen it in a couple other comments in the chat too. It can be really hard to find others that are willing to share that space of authenticity and to come to a new way. So what do we do when we get into those? And sometimes in our work environments, it's forced relationships, right? Things that we have to have relationships with people in groups because they've existed within our positions prior to us, etc. But really, they're not working. They're not evolving. Where what do we do when we've, attempted to kind of create these spaces to introduce more evolution, to have things shift into a better and evolved way, and yet we just can't find that catch? Is that something that we would kind of continue to try and have these conversations to try and echo that in, or is it one where then we do let it go? I love your last thing of just, how do I want to be changed by the relationships around me and that I have, where I think that's a really interesting point. But sometimes I recognize that those relationships are potentially changing me not in ways I want.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do in those situations within a work context?
Yeah. Excellent question. And I think some of this gets to creating the conditions for healthy conflict, which is a thing that I admire and but don't claim expertise in. So I don't want to speak in too much. The answer, the two things that come up that are relevant from the kind of relational work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
The first is that relationships thrive on boundaries. Part of that thing about coral reefs, part of that thing about lots of small clusters, relationships can only happen usually when there's some barrier that lets some information in and keeps most information out. Because if you allow yourself to be changed by everything, then you kind of explode. You kind of shake apart. It's too much entropy, right? Yeah. Relationship requires this sweet spot where you're changed, but not too much. And you're changed in ways which integrate with the other relationships around you. So, so barriers are important, and relationships which cross barriers are important. If there's a boundary that exists, that keeps two parts of a system from ever communicating with one another, then finding a way to create relationship across that boundary, finding containers that can bridge the conflict, can be incredibly transformative and powerful. And so I hear in you both times where what you want to do is construct those barriers and times where what you want to do is bridge them. When bridging them, and this is sort of a kindergarten level statement about peace building, but it's what I feel qualified to say. Think about the environment that the relationship is in. If the relationship happens in the workplace, there's a lot of entrenched patterns. There's a lot of ways that is, there's a lot of, if it's stuck, it's probably going to keep being stuck there. But if a different time if the relationship can exist in a different time and place, then there's, and that requires a shared commitment to go to that time and place, which cannot be easy. But if it can exist in a different time and place, then a lot of times those barriers can shift. And so thinking about what that different time and place is, and especially if it's a failure to express and communicate emotion, a time and place that is good for that. Mm-hmm. And kind of knowing that can exist and offering an invitation to it can be powerful.
Thank you. And I love the reaffirmation back and just the reconfirmation that boundaries are so vital in all of our relationships, even the ones in the workplace, and recognizing that sometimes we come up against those challenges for good reason.
And I want to let other people questions, but often the way I'll think about it is there can be a beautiful person who I love and respect, and that does not, I have a limited capacity to be in relationship. I have a limited capacity to change and be changed. If I'm changed by too many things, I'm going to shake apart. So there can be a beautiful person who within my limited capacity, I can only create this much space for. I don't have to disrespect them. I just have to know that like that relationship has its particular small niche in my ecology, because I need to hold space for bigger things.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bree. We have a number of questions here in the Q&A box, and one that we had promised to get to was about funding. And so I want to give you a chance to speak to that. A question from Margaret: how do you keep fundraising sustainable when funders don't seem to get the relational work? Is there a model that's more community funded or focused? What would you say about encouraging funders to fund relationship building?
So this is, I would say I'm in it. I don't have answers, but I've got things I'm experimenting with. That frankly, I'd love, if there's people who are also doing these sorts of experiments or have experience, I'd love feedback on. One thing I'm doing is taking some of these concepts and engaging with funders around them. There's, I think, an existing movement within the funding ecosystem around trust-based philanthropy, around decolonizing wealth, that around reparation and redistribution. And I'm seeing if some of this language about how we can and cannot predict relationships can be helpful to them in bringing more funders on board to this idea that you don't like have a grant full of predictions that is the thing that you fund. And secondary, parallel to that, I'm working with an organization called the Donor Organizer Hub, and really looking at movements that fund themselves internally. So the best way to fund relational work is to have people who are in the room and feel the magic fund it. This is part of why relational work for wealthy people tends to be really funded. And historically, if you look at the Montgomery Improvement Association, if you look at the Cesar Chavez and Cesar Chavez organized around farm workers and Dolores Huerta, they were funded by people in the community. And that gave them the freedom to do much more relational, much more radical work than they otherwise would be able to do. And so bringing back and building tools for that sort of community level funding, and then saying, all right, if money is moving within the community, if relationships are forming within the community, and we can capture some degree of indicators to know that relationships are forming within the community, are there people who are willing to provide matching funds to that funding internally so that it gets amplified? But the role of the funder is just to say, I see something here that's growing and I want to like water this soil, not I want to tell it where to grow.
I love the idea too, and you've talked about trust-based philanthropy a few times, but funders showing up differently and modeling different ways of holding and sharing power, and so just convening differently could be a thing that they can do. And there's a question that's related here from Tracy. We find that caring, kind, authentic space can be triggering for people, especially if they come from large institutional structures where the control dynamics are high. We try to let people know how we work is different, but it can still be jarring and take a fair amount of time. Any guidance? Like, is this just we keep doing it, keep modeling, keep practicing it, and eventually, we change the environment? Or any guidance on how when we're showing up differently, how do you do that in an authentic way?
I experienced this a little bit in working with tech workers. I often had to meet people at their professional identities and then like let them baby step away from them. Sometimes if someone's coming into like a weekend retreat, then I've got space for them to be uncomfortable. I can really like invite their whole selves in. I don't actually run weekend retreats, but I talk to a lot of people who do. If I've got that kind of a container, then I can do sort of this bigger step away from what they're used to. When I was organizing tech workers in spiritual crisis, I'd be like, okay, I know what's going on is that you joined this company because you wanted to uphold democracy, and now like you're seeing the opposite happen and you're freaking out on the inside, but you can't talk about that yet. Like, you can barely talk about that with me one-on-one. You definitely can't show up in a room full of other tech workers and talk about that. It's too vulnerable for you. So I'm not going to ask you to do that. but I am going to try to get to that with, at least, on one-on-one conversations, get to that place with maybe 20% of the room beforehand, so they all have this sense of a flavor of the thing they want to get to. And then when I create a space for them to come together, even if it's a, happy hour, I'm going to just have a more flexible container where people can be as vulnerable as not vulnerable as they want, and be gently inviting people into that more vulnerable space, and make sure that other people know we're doing it too.
All right. And last question. I'm going to kind of combine two. One from Elaine about diverse communities and how do you foster inclusiveness? Are all stories equal? And then from Manaz, does this work for all communities, privileged and marginalized communities? And if it does, are there differences we should be thinking about when working with more underserved communities?
So the first question is around all stories equal. I will say that my most recent experience is in working with fairly privileged communities of tech workers and with intersectional queer communities. So the things I'm saying, some of what I'm saying is sort of grounded in this concept of relationship that I think is pretty broadly universal. Some of it is really grounded in my experience in relational organizing those communities. So I don't want to, when I'm giving kind of organizing advice, I want to say what I know and not imply things about other communities. I think that the concept of a container for relationship where people can explore ideas, feel how they feel about them, and then commit to them is going to happen in different places. When building communities that cross lines of power and privilege, that is going to lines of power and privilege are going to really profoundly affect how that shows up. They're going to mean that unless intervention happens, some stories are going to be considered more important. They're going to take up more room than other stories, and that is going to prevent the community from going to some of the most relational and powerful places that it can. So I think understanding, I'm struggling because I'm saying this in the abstract, and I want to be able to make it concrete without making it prescriptive. But how we explore, how we differentiate, and then what we choose to focus in on. Systems of power and privilege like white supremacy and patriarchy want to take control of all of those things. They want to take control of them to allow only certain kind of relationships to form, to allow conversations to only go to a certain place. And so we have to recognize and release those systems of control if we want to unlock the most powerful relational possibility.
I love that. And I love that, that's as we close today, what I'm taking with me is that allowing yourself to be changed, allowing yourself to accept the emergence and not predict where it's going to go. And so that giving up control and kind of walking into those spaces. And then the understanding how we can, you used the word nurture, right? That we can nurture these spaces for relationship building through collaboration, convening, and care. And you've shared so many bits that we will follow up in the email with these key points, the resources, the platforms. So thank you so much for sharing how you're thinking about relationship building with us as we're looking to kind of take it from this kind of nebulous construct into something that's tangible and tactical and doable in our work. So thank you.
Thank you. And I just put my email address in chat. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'll put my LinkedIn there. Feel free. If anyone in the audience is doing this kind of work, I can't commit to every possible follow-up conversation, but would love to follow up with you all, talk about how this is happening with you, learn from you, and if there's ways to collaborate, explore that.
Love that. Thank you. Wishing everybody a really beautiful day. Bye-bye.